Hey guys, Lachlan from MBE here today. We're going to be talking about some anatomy, more specifically the pectoral girdle of the appendicular skeleton. Now if that doesn't make sense straight away, don't worry, it will in a little bit. Now before we actually get into the video, I have attached a PDF down in the description that will have just key terms that will help you throughout the video. So if you're ever lost and you don't understand some terms that I've used, just refer to the PDF and that will help you out. So jumping straight into it, we have our appendicular skeleton and we have our axial skeleton. Now, a nice way to break these up is the appendicular skeleton, which is the focus of this series, is every bone in your extremities and that your extremities attach to. So to simplify that a little bit, we have our arms and they attach to the pectoral girdle, which is the clavicle and scapula, which is going to be the main focus of this video. Now we also have our legs, but our legs attach to the pelvic girdle, the os coxae. So there we have it. That is the appendicular skeleton. It's our extremities and everything they attach to. So the axial skeleton is essentially everything that's left, and we call it sometimes the trunk, which is perfectly acceptable, but preferably we would have axial and appendicular skeleton because we would like to keep this correct in the anatomical terms. So now that we've talked about that, we can jump into the pectoral girdle, which we'll be starting with the clavicle. The clavicle is commonly referred to as the collarbone, but we will be using correct anatomical terms. So just remember that the collarbone and the clavicle, they're the same thing. So in the clavicle, we have two ends. We have the acromial end and the sternal end. The acromial end will be a great indicator of what we call other parts. Once we get the scapula involved, we'll learn why it's called the acromial end. And then we have the sternal end, which is connected to your sternum. Now your sternum is basically in the middle of your chest. It's somewhat called a breastplate. Now, if you've noticed, the clavicle is an almost S shape. It's a weird S, but an S nonetheless. So the clavicle has two ends, is S shaped, but there are some more key features that will help us identify which side of the clavicle we're looking at. So if we're looking at it straight on, so if I'm standing in front of you and I look at you, I'm looking at your anterior view of the clavicle. So I will see pretty much no distinguishing features. A nice smooth bone. You'll see the acromial end and you'll see the sternal end, obviously. But if we actually go behind you, and I can see through everything but the clavicle, I can start to see things. So I'm looking at the posterior view of the clavicle, and we can see that we have just a few things that can tell us that we're looking at the posterior side. The costal tuberosity is probably one of the easiest ways. It's almost like a lumpy, bumpy looking thing at the sternal end. So if we can't quite identify if it's the acromial or sternal end, we can look at the costal tuberosity, and we can see that it's on the sternal side. And this is usually how we can tell anterior to posterior, if you can't just tell it straight away. Alright guys, now that we've gotten a good understanding of the clavicle, we get to move on to the scapula, the second and last part of the pectoral girdle. Only having two bones, pretty simple, but the scapula can be a little confusing, especially when you get into the nitty and gritty of it. But just off first face value, we're going to look at the acromion, which, if you can remember, that sounds slightly familiar. Well, the clavicle had the acromial end, didn't it? Well, we get to look at the acromion now, which is the part that the acromial end articulates to. And this is very important because this is the only part of the pectoral girdle that that is a direct connection between the pectoral girdle and the axial skeleton. Moving on to this image here, it looks very confusing. A lot of new words and a lot of words in general. It's a little misleading. These are just different angles of the same scapula. It's just rotating a little bit. A few little nuances on different views, but all in all, they're pretty much the same. So starting off, we have our first little view here, which is the right scapula on an anterior view. And so we're going to have a look at it. What's interesting about the scapula is that quite a lot of the surface area is just flat and generally featureless. Well, this is because if you think about how many muscles attach to the scapula or have muscles around them. Obviously, the muscles that attach to the scapula are the muscles of the rotator cuff. Now these muscles, they generally help stabilize the shoulder joint. They also are responsible for the movement of the shoulder joint. But there's different regions for different muscles. One of these regions is the subscapular fossa, which we can see here on the anterior view. It is slightly concave, but besides that it's relatively featureless. Once again, it's just flat areas for these muscles to attach. For example, the muscle for this one is the subscapularis. Now, it has quite a few similar words to the subscapular fossa, so it's the subscapularis. Pretty easy to remember that muscle. Moving on to more of these regions, we have our posterior view. Now, if we're looking at it, we get to see the supraspinatus and infraspinatus. These two are basically the exact same as the subscapular fossa. The muscles are pretty much identical. They're just the word minus fossa. So it's just pretty much exactly the same. So nice and easy. Key detail is the spine subdivides these two. So the supraspinatus is separated from the infraspinatus by the spine. With most of the fossas out of the way, we're going to move on to the glenoid cavity. This is a very, very important part of the scapula. This is what your humerus attaches to. So this is what connects the scapula to your arm. If you take a lateral view to the scapula, it's very easy to see the glenoid cavity. This is quite obvious because if you just think of someone standing right next to you, if your arm suddenly disappeared, they'd see a big white articulating surface, which is the glenoid cavity. But now staying at that lateral view, we get to see some new words. We've got the infraglenoid tubercle and the supraglenoid tubercle. What are they? Well, they're essentially just there to keep and to make sure that your muscles attach properly. They serve as attachment sites for the muscles that hold the shoulder and arm in place. So that's really all they are for. If you remember back to the supraspinalis fossa and the infraspinalis fossa, well, these are the tubercles. So this is where the muscles actually attach to. Now that we know a lot more about the scapula and the clavicle, we put those two together and we have a pretty good understanding of what the pectoral girdle is. And we can now appreciate its function in moving and controlling the arm and shoulder. The fact that it forms the shoulder joint is crucial to any movement, any sort of abduction movement, moving your arm around anywhere. That's all responsible by this pectoral girdle, which we know its anatomy now. Later on, and in future videos, the physiology will be explained, and even muscles, etc., etc. There's so many more elements to learn about the pectoral girdle, besides just its anatomy. We're focusing on bones in this series of the appendicular skeleton, but later on down the track, there'll be many more videos on the physiology and other aspects of the pectoral girdle. Now that we have a pretty fundamental understanding of the bones of the pectoral girdle, the clavicle and scapula, we get to finish this video up. Obviously, there are a lot more things to be included in the pectoral girdle. Obviously, I touched a tiny bit on muscles. We don't know much about muscles right now, so don't worry about that. Future videos will have a lot more detail on the muscles, and generally the physiology of things in general. But for these videos and for this series, we're only focusing on the bones of the appendicular skeleton. Setting up for next week's video, we are going to be talking about the upper limb. So, following on from the scapula, we're going to be talking about the humerus, the radius, and the ulnar, and carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. This will be a very fun video to do. I hope you guys are excited for it, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.